Uh, Thank you all for joining us for our first event of Take Back the Week 2021, Queering Sexual Violence Prevention. Shannon, okay, all good. We're all good. Everything's fine. We really appreciate you joining us and hope that we can all learn a lot from today. We'll have some opportunities for our own reflections and learning and have some key takeaway and skills overall. And so without further ado, I guess we'll jump in and get started introducing ourselves. Thank you.
So sorry, everyone. Technical difficulty. Screen sharing is not my forte, but I am working through it. So before we get to personal introductions, I wanted to sort of introduce who we are and the space that we work for at the San Diego State Women's Resource Center. There are a few things that we strive to foster, and those are a vibrant, brave, and inclusive space that educates, empowers, and advocates for women's rights, a campus culture rooted in gender justice, feminist leadership, support to students facing gender-based oppression, healing, intersectional feminist activism, and enhancements to students' academic, personal, and professional success. That's also our center email at the bottom, and you can also find us. We're on Instagram at SDSUWRC. We post a lot of information about our events and resources that we offer, and just a lot of great educational content. So if that interests you, you can follow us there as well. We also wanted to introduce ourselves as co-hosts for this event. So my name is Shannon Gallagher. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a first-year graduate student in the Women's Studies Department, as well as a first-year graduate assistant at the Women's Resource Center. Just generally some information about me. My research interest centers queer theory and the making of LGBTQ+ identity. Personally, I love basking in the sunshine, young adult fiction, and making playlists.
Thank you, Shannon, for introducing yourself. Shannon and I both have in common that we both like basking in the sunshine. Hello, my name is Celine. I use she or they pronouns. I'm also one of the graduate assistants at the WRC, and I help lead and assist with a lot of our programming. I'm a second year in at SDSU, our psych program, and my research focuses on social movements and intergroup relations, especially for ethnic and gender minorities. And yeah, I'm really happy that we all get to share a community here in this space together. So thank you so much for doing that. Okay, we'd like to move to do a land acknowledgement to center and ground the beginning of each of our WRC events, but also wanting to acknowledge that there's more than we can do than a land acknowledgement. So a land acknowledgement is really good for shifting our ideas of ownership and space and the ways that we take up space and perhaps occupy land, and how we think about responsibility to the land and how we tend to it and how to preserve the life of it, etc. So I'm going to read a traditional land acknowledgement to start us off. We would like to acknowledge the custodians of this land, the Kumeyaay people, and their elders past and present. We acknowledge and respect their continuing resilience and culture, and recognize the strength, resilience, and capacity of the Kumeyaay people, and extend this respect to other Indigenous people who are present. We at the WRC would also like to encourage all of us to go beyond doing a land acknowledgement and shifting the way that we think to actively doing allyship, right? And allyship can look like a lot of different things. It can look like donating your time. It can look like educating yourself. It can look like donating your financial or monetary resources. I like as well to plug this one particular resource or initiative that's going on right now. It's a movement called Save the San Marcos Foothills, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Santa Barbara's last wild native grasslands is it's up to be bought by different companies to be developed into housing and or corporate developments. And there's a group of activists who would like to save that land to preserve its nature, obviously. And there's different ways that you can contribute to this. You can volunteer, which would be 1 to 2 hours a week if you have that time and you live in that area or proximal to it. You can educate others about why we're trying to preserve this site on site. If you're also interested in wildlife or your major is related to physical or natural sciences, they're also looking for people to observe wildlife on their land to help promote the importance of preserving this natural space. You can also donate your money. There's a link there to do so. And if you want more information and to engage with their resources and to engage with an Indigenous-led initiative and social movement, then you can follow Save the San Marcos Foothills on Instagram. And as this program centers on sexual violence prevention, we'd also like to note ending the pandemic of violence of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or MMIW. I'm going to post a resource guide in the chat that has a lot of different things that we can do in our own time, or say that this let's say that this event ends 5 minutes early and you have 10 to 15 minutes before your next thing. I'd highly encourage you to read this. It provides a brief overview of what MMIWG stands for and what it's about. It basically refers to the endemic of violence against Indigenous women and girls, both sexual and physical violence that is largely committed by people who are not Indigenous or non-Native. So, and there's content warnings for that website as well. And I'm going to say content warnings related to sexual violence and violence and what I'm about to say. But Indigenous women and girls are up to 10 times more likely to experience both sexual and physical violence during their lifetimes. And oftentimes there's a lack of community accountability because of the jurisdiction of different lands, or these things happen on both state land, or maybe it's on a national park or national lands, or in between where it's considered their own sovereign territory. But because of that, people absolve themselves of responsibility, right? Like a police department would be like, that's not our land, we can't do anything about that, or are not willing to look for it. Or this violence is often committed by the people who are sworn, quote unquote, to protect these certain areas in Native people's lands. So that broadly refers to the pandemic of violence that has been going on, especially in the US and in Canada, which is, I think, the basis of this movement. And this resource, if you click on it, or if you have the time to do it, I would highly recommend. They have many short videos and webinars educating yourself on what you can do to be a better ally to Native women and girls, what you can do to help prevent sexual violence in your own community, or how you respond to sexual violence in your community. You can learn more about Indigenous culture through that website. There's a really great webinar called Mending the Rainbow that I'm looking at here, working with the Native LGBT Two-Spirit community webinar. You can support and celebrate Two-Spirit or LGBTQ people, etc. There's also lots of data on there as well. So if you're more interested in the data side of it and what you can do and want to learn more about how long this has been happening for, or why it's historically under-tracked, there's lots of reports by different nonprofit organizations, but also by national governments. There's lots of scholarly journals and dissertations essentially going through this. And there's also organizations that do this work to help respond to sexual violence in Indigenous communities. So you can donate there, but also you can see the resources that they have. So just wanted to plug that to begin and center our event for today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Celine, for all those resources. Before we begin, I also wanted to kind of give everybody an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We've sort of broken it down into three main sections. The first is mainstream sexual violence prevention frameworks. So we're going to ask the question, what prevention and healing techniques are widely used and validated? Second, we'll be talking about challenging heteronormative responses to intimate partner violence, so how does this large facet of our culture influence our responses to harm and violence prevention? And third, last but not least, beyond the binaries in sexual violence prevention. So we want to deconstruct some boundaries to expand healing and prevention methods in sexual violence prevention. So expanding on all of these things, sexual violence prevention, right? What do we know about sexual violence prevention and supporting survivors already? Again, I'm going to say this a lot, before we get into the material today, we wanted to provide some sort of grounding questions and sort of general food for thought to help us kind of center the ways that we've been taught to think about this and how we often speak about it, and help to center our ways of thinking about sexual violence and be open to reframing our thoughts. And just sort of three general things to consider. One, common techniques that we know or that people know when supporting survivors of harm. Two, what do people know about what causes sexual violence, right? Like what's the root cause of it? And three, what are the things we know how to do to reduce the culture and the stigma around sexual violence, right? And who does that affect and who does that benefit? Again, these are questions for you to reflect on. They don't require an answer right now, but if you feel called to share your thoughts in the chat, we absolutely welcome that. And we want to acknowledge that this is a space to learn and work through and expand sort of your knowledge and your thought process on sexual violence prevention.
Thank you. As Shannon said, if you want to in the chat, maybe just say one thing that you know already about sexual violence prevention, right? Like if you know that if somebody's telling you a story that, or their survivor story, or they're disclosing to you that you should listen and you should believe them and validate them, then that's something that you already know and a skill in your toolkit that you already have. So we really want to like capitalize on what we community already know and have between us. You can also say that like, oh, I know that it's related to structural violence, right? Or like sexual violence is also a cultural thing. Yeah, I see people sharing in the chat about ways that we can support survivors and things that we already know. I'd also like us to think about, and these are all things that maybe all of us can relate to in some ways because we all have various and different identities, but let's think about what else is at stake when experiencing sexual violence. So when an instance of harm happens, we can also think about the other areas of our life destabilized, right? You might have to take time off, or you might have less emotional capacity. You might have a depleted bandwidth, or you might lose your housing. You might lose job security, right? You might have to move jobs and be unemployed for a while because you were sexually assaulted at work. And so there are all these other factors that are impacted and at stake when somebody experiences sexual violence. So when we try to address the root of sexual violence, we can't just address, okay, let's make sure this doesn't happen to you anymore, or that you're removed from the situation. It's also, how can we make sure you're in a safe, stable place where you feel like you can grow and you can heal and you have access to those resources, right? Are you experiencing food insecurity? In that case, right, that's something really important to address in order to support a survivor. And so all these things, and here's a wheel here of different identities that we all have. Sexual violence both co-varies with these things, but it's also a precursor to vulnerability. So as I just mentioned, experiencing sexual violence can make you vulnerable, right? Your education status changing, geographic location needing to change, right? And being more vulnerable to gender or racial violence, etc. However, these things all we say is a covariate with sexual violence, meaning that depending on your identity related to these other groups, you may be more or less vulnerable to sexual violence statistically, right? And why is that? And how do we say that in a way that is survivor-centered and survivor first? And so when addressing sexual violence, we need to note that any intervention which does not center these other central entities is not addressing the root of the problem. If we know, right, that Indigenous women and girls are more likely to experience sexual violence when a pipeline has been introduced to their land and they set up these work camps or man camps, and historically that is when an endemic of violence is known to spike in different states, is when you have contractors working in a specific land to install something previously an unbought or protected land. That's when there's increased cases of sexual and physical violence against this group. If we don't address that they are also Indigenous and they're also been marginalized in their experiences in so-called US, then we're not addressing sexual violence at the root, right? We need to address capitalism and the act of buying and selling land. We need to address patriarchy, where this is seemingly a gendered issue, right? Where it's happening between one gender that has structural power and another gender more often than the inverse happens, which is not to say that that does not happen, but we need to be competent and literate to talk about why it both ways and how to support survivors with different genders, right? What I need may be different than what a survivor who is presenting or typically masculine needs. For example, if something happens to me, I might not want to walk at night anymore because of the way that I present. I present rather femme presenting. I am very short, honestly. And so that might be things that I factor into, right? Like I might like blue lights on campus and a safe walk or something like that. Another survivor who's more masculine, those things or want those things. And so we can provide gender specific and gender affirming care to prevent sexual violence based on our identities. And then now I'd like us to think about which of these are most commonly relevant related to sexual violence. I think first we always think about gender, right? And we like to talk about those statistics being very different for different genders. Or the rate of sexual violence occurring to different genders is often very different. But also think about other things that co-vary with it, right? Like physicality or qualities are often covariates for experiencing sexual violence. So is age. Does abuse happen when you're isolated from your family and you're put into a certain nursing home? Or does immigration status also impact that? If you're here in the US on a visa and you're isolated from your family and you need to be married to a certain person in order to remain and keep your job, are you going to speak out to authorities about sexual violence if that means that you will be deported? Likely not. Experience also another covariate, right? And who is it more likely to happen to in the military? Terms of accountability are there in place in our government and military that will ultimately check the people that already have power? Does that exist? Job classification as well is another big one, right? And we think about glass ceilings and moving up and having positions of power and stability. If we don't have that, or certain genders are excluded because of gender biases or because of language barriers or having an accent, which we know influence hiring decisions, then how do we know right? The people that clean our schools, that clean our hallways, that have certain accents, that don't have necessarily white collar jobs, etc. Okay, I think we can move to the next slide. Go over a brief sexual violence legislation just to make us aware of some of the ways that we think about what sexual violence is, or even how the law treats it, is rooted in a colonial history, right? America is a colony, and we're barely over 200 years old. So let's think about how America and our laws, and if you have ever gone to or you will ever go to court about this, how they will treat this language. And so in the late 1700s, American colonies, and this lasted for a while, their first legal American definition and of sexual violence was only defined as rape. So that was as narrow as it got. And they defined it as the carnal knowledge of a woman 10 years or older, forcibly and against her will. However, this was only applied to white women. White women were the only ones who could come forward with these allegations or cases to be tried in court. And overall, this is a very narrow definition of sexual violence, right? It refers to a certain type of violation from one or it refers to penetration, right? And specifically of a female body. And that's their definition of it. When we know, right, that like penetrative sex can happen between multiple genders and all genders, and there's more than sexual violence than just that, etc. It wasn't until 1861 that Black women were able to file rape charges against Black or white men, because previously as slaves, Black people could not refuse sexual advances. But it's important to note that juries at this time were majority all white. And at the time, there were still headlines that were, this was around the time that women's clubs first started to begin, and they would collect data and note on how if you brought a case to court and you were an ethnic minority, or especially a Black woman, and you brought forth this case or allegation, you would likely not be believed and it would be dismissed because you would be perceived, right, as being both a sexual conquest, but also wanting that because you want the power and privilege that white men have, etc. In 1929, the FBI removed that 10 years or older clause from their definition of rape. Unsure why they removed that specific part, right, to be more inclusive of children, perhaps, but their limited definition remains. There were no main other amendments made. And then I also want to know that all of this information is taken from a student's project from Women's Studies 572. All of their projects covering sexual violence prevention and their community healing techniques will be live on our website. So if you Google SDSU WRC, all of their projects and their information and their research are on there. Would highly recommend you check it out. There's some really great work and brilliance there, including annotated bibliographies. This was a timeline. It was really great. Thank you, Elsbeth, for plugging that in the chat. And so it wasn't until 1962 that our government legally, formally recognized that there are more forms of sexual violence than just physical contact. Or sorry, not than just physical contact, but than just rape. However, these were all limited, all these definitions were limited to physical contact and emotional coercion in some sense. So they included unwanted sexual attention, verbally and physically, drugging, and being aware of somebody's mental capacity in order to give consent, etc. But all of these things are very implicit and they don't get at power dynamics, right? They're still saying of like, overall you were coerced, or they touched you or they said something to you, but that's a physical outward action. It's not an implicit power dynamic that happens that violates your boundaries. And then in 1975, rape shield laws passed in Congress to make it more difficult to use one's sexual history against them. So the most typical defense used at the time for, I know nothing about law, so I'm trying to think about the person who is accused of being a perpetrator of sexual violence. They would often use the case that person is not a virgin, or they like sleep with lots of other people, etc. So they probably wanted it, or they influenced me to do it. And that was the first time that stopped being a large. It still is used, right, if we see in our mainstream discourse about sexual violence, but that was the first time I was formally encouraged to not do that in court. Thank you for sharing resources in the chat. I'm seeing Consent is Like Tea is a great YouTube video about consent. Love that, and hope that we can take these things with us. And so I just like us to think about the ways that we think about sexual violence and what we perceive as being credible and believable versus not. So you might think when you see a major headline about sexual violence and then we read more about it, implicitly you might think like, oh, it wasn't the worst case scenario, or it wasn't the worst thing, or at least she's okay, or it was this, therefore it's not as bad as something else. We should not be the ones trying to assign weight to somebody else's trauma, but also how they experience that trauma, right? And what makes it more or less bad. Chanel Miller, who you may have heard of, she was a survivor that went to court about her sexual violence case, and she was raped by I forget his last name. I'm sorry. I think it's Brock. Last name Stanford swimmer, and we know that about him and much less about her. Brock Turner. Thank you. Okay. I was just not there. She was believed to be a white woman because her identity was anonymous for the first few years of her case, and that dragged on for a while. Highly recommend her memoir. She was thought of to be a white woman in papers and in the courts to people who didn't see her for about 3 years, she says, because people just assume that as a high profile case and somebody who had this happen to her, she was a white woman. And so she was like, no, like being an ethnic minority, like is central to my experience of sexual violence. It's central to my ability to access resources, right? And she's like, if I can talk in two languages to my grandparents, I need to be able to talk to them in two languages in order to explain what happened to me, right? And have culturally specific and culturally affirming care. But the way that our courts have been set up to think about who is a perfect victim, who's a perfect perpetrator, et cetera, made her white for the first few years of her case. And that ultimately made a lot of her invisible.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Celine. So the next thing we want to talk about is sort of challenging heteronormative responses to IPV or intimate partner violence. Also, I want to sort of quickly define our two main terms for today. Sexual violence and intimate partner violence. So the term intimate partner violence oftentimes describes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or psychological harm by a current or former partner or spouse. And the term sexual violence is an all-encompassing non-legal term that refers to crimes like sexual assault, rape, and sexual abuse. Um, Oftentimes when we're having these discussions, we can see that intimate partner violence often overlaps with sexual violence, kind of like a Venn diagram, and there's some similarities in the middle. Some sexual violence is intimate partner violence, and some intimate partner violence is sexual violence, but there's more to both than what is in that sort of area of similarity. And also, in thinking about sort of challenging these like normative thoughts that we have about intimate partner violence. Sorry, I keep getting that confused with a different acronym, and in my brain is a million places. But I wanted to sort of pose this question of when we think about intimate partner violence, what are our assumptions? What like images come to mind? What situations come to mind? If you are interested in answering that in the chat, I think often for many of us, we're going to think about romantic and sexual relationships. We're going to think about heterosexual couples, right? We're going to think about white couples. We're going to think about men who have power and physical dominance over frail young white women, right? I think that's oftentimes the narrative that many of us conjure up. So thank you for those of you that are putting things in the chat. And there is some good reason that we sometimes have this idea of what that looks like. Because historically, as Celine mentioned, certain institutional and romantic relationships were made illegal, right? Like only white women could come forward, Black women, women of color were not allowed. They were assumed that they couldn't experience pain, couldn't experience sexual violence, right? So that's something that we definitely need to acknowledge. And additionally, there might be an overrepresentation of heterosexual relationships when we're having these kind of discussions, right? When we see it on TV, you see it on true crime sort of documentaries, you see it played out, you know, on TV shows, in books, in songs, all these different things. And so I think sometimes we get very much like stuck in this narrative of this is what intimate partner violence looks like, right? It's this very stereotypical white male female situation. And so what we want to do, I think what we're trying to do is push us to consider power dynamics and gendered implications of power. So many responses then to this idea of intimate partner violence today include safe houses, economic and geographical support, and we present these solutions under the assumption that people that are more vulnerable to intimate partner violence are going to be socially disadvantaged too because of their identity as women and also specifically as white women. And so we want to broaden this idea of how can we better support survivors of all different intersections of identity and recognize that those intersections of identity place people at different sort of needs and levels of care and all of these things. And like I said, we think that it typically happens to women. That is not untrue, but again, pushing our thinking and understanding and really ask the question of what is the root of why this is more likely to happen to women. And that sort of goes back to patriarchy and structural power. And I think it's really important to reflect for us, like as a society and as people, how are we unequipped to talk about this in non-heterosexual relationships, or when this happens to men, or when this happens to gender non-conforming individuals? And I think this is often because the only power differential we've been given in analyzing intimate partner violence and sexual violence prevention techniques is gender, right? So we don't think about, we think about men hurting women, we think about that sort of power dynamic between men and women, but it's so much more than that, you know. And I think if we step out of gender, I think we can see that it's person with the power, person without the power, and what are the social institutions at play that give certain people power and give other individuals less power. So I think that that's really important to reflect on and think about today.
Unreading myself. Cool. Thank you so much, Shannon, for providing us with that background and laying that groundwork for beginning to analyze power dynamics. So there's a lot on this slide, but before we get into that, I'd like us to think about whether or not you're a student, staff, you work somewhere or you don't. Think about in your workplace or your school, what sort of gender specific care exists for women or gender minoritized people. This can be something like paid maternity leave, which of course can be applicable to more than just women, or it can be like in a classroom discussion, have your professors mention gender before you have a seminar or a discussion. Have they talked about gender biases? Do they talk about the different ways that we encode different tones of voice or the credibility of women in media? When you get your syllabus and you see who's on it and who's listed and cited, unless you're in a women's studies course or department perhaps, are there an equal amount of different genders in it? Are there gender non-conforming folks in it? And if so, then do they explain to you why women were shut out of your field and pushed out of publication? If you can name any of that there, or you know what your office or workplace has done to help protect and support women, then please share that in the chat. I'd love to hear about what we know and what we have already out there. And that's because what Shannon was saying, right, like a lot of our responses to sexual violence already has centered women, and it centered our idea of a perfect, vulnerable white woman survivor. And this includes economic and structural economic, structural, and geographical or food related support. But why are we only equipped to support women and support survivors after harm has happened, right? There can be preventative measures, right, of making sure that women are paid equally as men. Then we wouldn't necessarily have to have as many safe houses for survivors if everybody makes a living wage, or everybody's guaranteed housing regardless of their income, right, or wherever they work. So there's different things that we can do as allies, but also let's think about getting preventative now and making sure that we're not only providing gender specific care after harm has happened. And so gender roles and patriarchy, of course, can reinforce this tradition of violence. And we can see, as Shannon talked about, how access to economic and social resources influences one's vulnerability, right? You know that somebody can keep coming back to you if they're reliant on you. And this is also why things happen to both elders and to children, because they're dependent possibly financially or psychically or physically, etc. Harm can also be less about gender and more about power. And so the reason why sexual violence is a gendered issue is because of patriarchy. It's because historically, one gender has more power than others. And now let's think about how would we define harm? What does harm mean to you? And so I'll pause and just think about of what it means to be harmed. And I think this is one way that we can talk about this and center this. Is it not about applying power intentionally or not? So somebody can hurt you because they have more power than you unintentionally, right? Like if your boss, oh, how was your weekend? Like, tell me how you're doing, tell me anything about it. You might not want to tell them because you're like, you're determining my pay grade, or I don't want you to judge me, right? If you have to get it or review at the end of the that's an application of power dynamics, but you still might feel uncomfortable in such a way. That might not be harm necessarily, but we can see how that can be exacerbated. Yes, and harm isn't always physically visible. It can be emotional, financial. It can be being like, oh, you need to do more household labor because my job pays more. When really it's like, engineering degree shouldn't pay you more than my degree necessarily should, right? It's just that we should both have access to economic stability and food stability that we want so that we can create a more equitable partnership. So harm can be about applying power, coercion, and violating sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean or feel like in our bodies? Sovereignty is consent and choice. And so it's on each of us as our own autonomous whole being, and making sure that we're treating in a way that honors that. So that means that I can have choice to do whatever I want with my body, but also that I can give consent. And if I don't give consent, then I can be violated in that sense. Thank you for sharing your definitions of what harm is to you. And so patriarchy makes many assumptions about gender inherently is, and so I'd like to make this more concrete. Patriarchy makes us about power, what women are powerful enough to do, what they're capable of doing. We see this both sports, but also competence, right? When applying to different things. Yeah, so we see that with like glass ceilings, quote unquote, at work, credibility. So when or when not women are believed. There's been lots of cool backgrounds in social psychology, but when women say the exact same thing as a man, same way and tone, you're more likely to believe that maybe if he's nicely or he looks to have a college degree and he's articulate, etc. There's also this with the medical industrial complex, right, where women are not believed pain in their bodies, especially Black women. And that's because of a myth that Black women can tolerate more pain than other races or genders, but also that women don't know their bodies well, or that we're over exaggerating our pain, or because it's related to our reproductive and sexual organs and system, that as a taboo topic, and that's something that we don't want, or that society often women from stepping into their related to, we're not going to be believed when we advocate for our needs. We can also think about parents' assumptions there. Roles. If we don't actively believe in gender roles of, oh, I should stay home or I need to work or be a stay-at-home mom, other people might want to do that, and that's totally okay. We can still have implicit assumptions over what women are meant to be. Like we often think of, oh, women are just more caring than men, when inherently there is no gender difference, right? Like biologically, I am not more capable of this than a gender, but we're socialized to have these different skills, just like I was socialized to be attuned to my social environment, maybe in the needs of my elders around me, whereas men are not taught that to this end. There's also value, right, and wherefore. So I would like to note that idea of man as woman, and that gender binary is a colonial construct. It's approximately 2 years old, fun fact, and that was created by both European and American scientists to push a white supremacist agenda. So before that, gender was not perceived as a binary in a lot of indigenous cultures, but the idea of gender was created in order to make a distinction between the white race and any other race, and or a more advanced civilization and a more primitive civilization. And so they said that the more advanced gender and your race is, the greater gender differences and gender roles you're going to have. And this was published in textbooks throughout the 1800s within the US. And this is what the scientific community largely believed in. And that's where we get this narrative of men and women being inherently different. It's because we wanted to push this narrative, right, of women are supposed to be racial conduits for their race and to advance that. And if they leave the domain of their home, then we're slipping backwards into a more primitive society. Well, that is obviously not the case. But now we have all these structures in place that reflect that because we were built on this country, right? And it's relatively new. There was a time before that, there can be a time after that.
Okay. Whoa, excuse me, my voice did a weird thing. I apologize. So in terms of challenging sort of this heteronormative responses to intimate partner violence and sexual violence, we want to provide maybe some prevention frameworks and sort of ways that we can change communities through changing norms, because now that we've gotten into an analysis of sexual violence harm, we want to talk about changing the culture and how do we do that, right? It seems like this insane, impossible sort of like mountain to climb, especially with all of the history that we have and the ways that, you know, we've been socially conditioned. Want to provide a baseline framework that many organizations and working groups use. It may be altered or modified here and there, but essentially it's the same sort of prevention framework. And the first one is strengthening individual knowledge and skills. So enhancing an individual's capacity of preventing violence and promoting safety. In practice, this kind of looks like what all of us are doing right now, right? We're attending an event to expand our knowledge and to expand our ways of thinking about sexual violence prevention, what sexual violence has, what we've been taught to assume about it, what we've been taught to assume about intimate partner violence. And we're sort of working to undo that and undo our own biases and our own assumptions together in a space like this. So I'm super grateful that we all can spend an hour together today and sort of break down these ideas. The second is promoting community education. So this involves reaching groups of people with information and resources to prevent violence and promote safety. So for example, it's sort of similar to what Celine and I do, or anybody who works at the WRC, through events like these and having both on and off campus resources available to students, available to community members. We're sort of providing that education at sort of an institutional level, right? Third is educating providers. At this step, this can be done individually. Coalitions or communities can inform providers who will transmit skills and knowledge to others and help potentially model positive norms, right? So it's sort of like um, understanding what individuals or communities need and bringing those needs to light, and then sort of modifying your trainings or your resources in order to better serve those communities and their needs. Fourth is changing organizational practices. So here we change our ways of thinking and work to adopt regulations and shape norms to prevent violence and improve safety in a way that doesn't reinforce harm, right? Which is sort of like our main theme for Take Back the Week, like right, like transformative justice, right? So how can we move outside of these frameworks of involving more state violence and more state institutions that might be rooted in these sort of patriarchal heteronormative ways of thinking? And lastly, influencing policies and legislation. So at the highest step and the largest level, we can rally to enact laws and policies that support healthy community norms and a violence-free society, right? So kind of like Celine was saying earlier, it's not just about being able to react to violence after violence has occurred or harm has occurred to somebody. It's about being able to create institutional structures that don't allow for that to happen in the first place, right? So examples being, the ways that we assume that men and women are different, sort of changing the ways that boys and girls are brought up, changing the ways that, or like the pay rate and all of those different things. There's so many different avenues that we can change. And so, but just through legislation and through laws.
Cool. So for the last part of our program, we want to talk about going beyond the binaries of thinking about harm. We've talked about power dynamics, and largely, if you've noticed in this presentation, we talk about one-on-one violence and or broader structural cultural violence onto one person. Let's talk about breaking that binary down a little bit and expanding our care and community holding. So community holding basically looking like accountability and being in relationship with other people. And you need to be in relationship with other people in order to be harmed by them, in order to be more intersectional. Okay, let's unpack this idea of the perfect victim and what does it reinforce. And so let's think about, there's often this narrative that in order to be believed or to have your case being worth taking up by our legal system, but also to receive help and support, I said self, to be supported by your community, you need to be the perfect victim. And let's unpack that on a personal level and see what it feels like to our bodies. What are our internal beliefs about being deserving and worthy? So do you think that you are inherently deserving of access to food, water, housing, dignity, respect, etc., for existing? And if so, yes, then how is that not reinforced by possibly your culture, right? We think about certain jobs deserve certain pay, or you deserve this title or respect because you have a degree, right? And so let's unpack our internal beliefs about what other people deserve. Like we see like, oh, you worked so hard for that, you deserved it. When really it's a combination of work and structural factors, right? And you're allowed to be proud of the work that you do and what you bring to the table, while also acknowledging your privilege. While also seeing when somebody else makes a really big purchase or they buy a home, you can say, oh, you worked so hard and you saved up so much money. It's also that, but it's also them not being affected by redlining, right? Or like decreased pay because of their identities, etc. So there's different forms of work that take place behind the scenes that influence what we're deserving of and how we portray that in mainstream society. Like we think like, oh, you work so hard to graduate, like you really deserve that. And it's also like, yes, but I can graduate because I can stare at a screen for 4 to 6 hours a day, and not everybody has the ability to do that. I have internet access, etc. That's why I can graduate on time. So it's not just me and not just my hard work at all. And then let's examine our internal beliefs about being worthy. And let's think about, when was the last time that you thought of yourself as being worthy and deserving of respect? For me, I think that this idea comes up most when I've been disrespected. Then I'm like, wait, I don't deserve that, which means I do deserve this. And so our ideas about this are often reinforced by meritocracy and capitalism. We assign worth to people based on what we think they have worked for or how high they have gotten. And so what would happen if we looked at others with dignity and centered consent and child education? So I think somebody put this in the chat earlier too, but it's giving your children and youth the option to, if they don't want to give you a hug, they don't have to. If they don't want to play at recess and they want to stay inside, then they can do that, right? And let's say that your child doesn't want to do homework or something like that. Can you give them the choice to do it on their own time, or do they understand the importance of doing the homework? Do they need to do that? Or are there other ways of thinking, right? Maybe they want to create a project with you and they can learn the math just as well through doing that. Can you give them that option? Access to that infrastructure and having the time and resources is going to co-vary by our privilege. But these are other things that we can do to teach our children, right? That they have autonomy over their body, they have consent. If they say that they're tired, then can we let them rest instead of saying, oh, we have to continue the day because I have other plans, or I was planning on doing this, instead of teaching them to listen to their body of, I'm tired, I need to log off, or I need to go home and take a nap. And we can teach that at the same time that we teach responsibility to our family, to our relationships, etc. But we ought to teach them, right, that their body is theirs, their decisions are also theirs. And then what would happen if we centered compassion, both for ourselves, but also our children's experiences? Oftentimes, I think we impose on children and youth this narrative, right, of if they say that they're tired, you would tell them, oh, you need to be resilient, or like today's not over, like it's only 4 p.m., like you still have homework, you have practice to go to, and then you tell them that this is a part of growing up, is pushing through things, right, and becoming resilient or working through pain, etc. There's definitely some merit in personal growth that can happen through meeting challenges, but are the challenges being met on their own terms? And so to make sure that we're meeting challenges on our own terms, we can center compassion, right? So think about yourself and what is the most compassionate thing that you can do for yourself? It would not be to let yourself off easy all the time, right? Or whatever letting yourself off easy means. It would be to prioritizing your growth, but also your sustainability, and knowing that your self-worth is always centered, right? So knowing that I can grow by pushing myself to work extra late one night if I want to get a project done, but making sure that it's sustainable in the long run for me. And I want us to think about, what does harm feel like in our bodies at the somatic level and or a mental level? So think about, we don't necessarily have to do an extreme case, but think about the last time that somebody said something that might have hurt you, and it was like a slight microaggression or comment. Did you feel pain in your chest or in your body or in your brain? Were you confused for a little bit? I know that like my processing tends to lag a little bit because I'm now thinking about that comment, even though the conversation is carried on. So my brain gets a little bit, it feels hotter, etc. Where else do we carry that pain? I think we can carry it in our chest, in our stomachs, in our hearts. And people here are talking about, right, like teaching our children to describe their body parts and to name them and to know about them. That gives them so much agency and power, right? If they know what their body is and how it's working and they can name, this is what my body is doing, that's giving them agency back. So let's think about how we talk about and heal boundaries, even with children, right? Do we let them name when they're uncomfortable? I think oftentimes we're not creating a space for people who are younger than us, or maybe people who work under us, to say, oh, I'm uncomfortable, or I don't like the way that you've been treating me, or I don't like the way that you rushed me before we go to school. I know that I have a problem with being late, but can we try this instead, right? And you can come up with a solution with your child for that. Yeah, and giving them language to name their body parts, especially sexual body parts, etc. Okay. And then also being survivor-centered. So what does this mean? A lot of sexual violence prevention frameworks talk about being survivor-centered and ultimately being about the experience of whoever survived harm. And we'll talk about getting beyond that economy in a second, but first let's think about recovery and healing for the survivor. What does that mean? It ultimately means divesting from state-derived definitions of harm. And that's because in our legal system, and you can also look this up related to both our legislation, but also the creation of the police, and what instances of harm and violence we take to court, the state definition of harm is related to property and the violation of a boundary related to owning something and or what you can or cannot do. So the state ultimately commodifies our bodies, right, and says that you have access to this part of your well-being, or you have access to your home, somebody broke in and that harm happened because they violated your property, or ultimately your body is your property that you own and somebody violated that in some way. And so just wanting to understand that harm can be energetic, it can be emotional, it can be mental, it can be spiritual, and it's not necessarily related to property, but also we don't have to commodify ourselves to recognize harm. The momentum and direction of safety conditions, so whatever you do after harm has happened and however your organization continues and what you do, will be determined by the individual needs. So whatever that person needs, if they need time off, then you give them that. If they need to be transferred to a different department, you give them that, etc. If they need to have a conversation that's facilitated, then they can also have that as well. But ultimately, this points to the co-creation of a community and co-creation of healing relationships. So community